We've been witness to the proliferation of hate crimes throughout the United States. A lot of folks who are quite anti-democratic, who would like to live in a white Christian nationalist state. And this is very concerning, but there's some good work on the other side of this. Today, we're joined by Eric Ward, who has had 3 decades of leadership in community organizing and philanthropy, working with the Western State Center as the executive director and a senior fellow with the Southern Poverty Law Center. And in 2021, won the Civil Courage Prize and the first American to do so, which is perhaps signaling to us that we've had quite the dangerous proliferation of anti-democratic rhetoric and hate crimes in the United States. Thank you so much for joining us today, Eric.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
So recently we had Solomon Pena run for office as a GOP candidate in New Mexico and has recently been arrested in connection to crimes committed, the shooting up of several houses of Democratic members of Congress and local government as well in New Mexico. Can you tell us a little bit about this case?
Absolutely. So we have a former GOP candidate who is running for state representative. His name is Solomon Pena, and he lost that race, meaning the majority of that district decided not to choose him. And in his frustration and anger, he responded by hiring other people to attack and target the homes of Democratic officials and their families. And we know now that Solomon Pena actually participated in at least one of the attacks. This seems to be a growing trend within politics, largely driven by the rhetoric of the GOP that is telling America that if we do not submit to them through the ballot, that they will use the bullet in order to subvert the American will. And this is what we've seen in New Mexico. And I think it's important to put it in context. This is part of a long strand of political attacks. Before that, we saw the attack on the home of former Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, where her husband, Paul Pelosi, was injured so significantly that he had to be hospitalized. It is also part of an ongoing series of harassment of elected officials, primarily Democrats, but not all. This includes also the stalking of congressional representative out of Washington State, Pramila Jayapal, right, who had individuals driving around her home screaming out profanities that were both racist and sexist, threatening to harm her. And it took her hours to get support from local law enforcement and from federal services. Elected officials are under attack. And if elected officials are under attack, the American public is not too far behind.
So it's been elected officials that have been the target of these attacks, but it seems to be that they're attacking a larger system at play here, right? If they're not winning these elections, they're claiming they're rigged, as he did, and the Albuquerque Journal reported it. That's Solomon Pena. And then we have, the January 6th attack as well. A lot of these are stemming from lies that our democracy is not functioning, but it's coming from a deeper place, that because they don't like the outcome of the election. They're standing up against it, saying that it was rigged. It's undemocratic at its core. And do you see that as the reason for these attacks?
Absolutely. I think we're seeing several things that are driving this political violence. The first is the embrace by Republican leadership of the big lie. This idea that there is a secret elite, right, that is at work globally in order to attack and destroy, right, white Americans. It's known as QAnon or the replacement theory, right? A host of names. But we should understand that that big lie has been used to not just entertain folks, but to subvert American democracy through violence. So we have watched since 2017 a growth of political violence. We should remember that in the midst of the George Floyd protests, right, still not understood by the American public, are the loss of 19 people who were killed around the country, right? In relationship to these protests, the majority African American. Now we know some of these individuals were targeted through gun violence. We know some were attacked physically, and we know some were attacked using physically using vehicles to strike them or run them over. We have no full accounting in this country of the real level of political violence, but we do know some things. We know that the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project has told us, for instance, that paramilitary far-right activity in 2022 is on track to exceed the level of activity reported in 2021. The violence is very real. And it is attempting to do three things. The first is mission-driven political violence that seeks to subvert, right, the American democracy through intimidation and fear. The second are spontaneous acts of violence that are taking place at protests and in the public square. And then the third that we are witnessing is political rhetoric that is grounded in violence, despite the fact that countless studies tell us each and every day that the irresponsible rhetoric of violence by elected officials drives a direct correlation to actual violence in the streets and the communities of America. This is an attempt to terrify the American public, and it is an attempt to try to undermine or to send this message that the federal government is unable to protect American citizens. That's the point of that violence.
Oftentimes, it's someone's first touch point with the criminal punishment system, our penal system in the United States, it's the police. And we've seen time and again, the police, letting in folks, members of far-right groups, pass through the subway turnstiles without paying, seeming that they're on the same side. In many occasions, we've seen oftentimes police officers participate in these rallies. How does that affect our ability to respond to political violence in the streets?
It breaks down community trust. And when we lose community trust between the community and law enforcement quickly is unable to provide community safety. That credibility by law enforcement is important, and it's being lost in very significant ways. It benefits the white nationalist movement. I'm not here to say every law enforcement officer is part of a far-right organization. What I'm saying is their unwillingness to distance themselves from those organizations and the tactics and the rhetoric cost them credibility within their communities. And that has a direct relationship to crime statistics, to the harm that's being done. At the end of the day, it's the responsibility of the Department of Justice and the federal government to rein in and to ensure that the American public sees law enforcement as an unbiased agency, right? That is not functioning in the bias of the political partisanship that is happening in our society. We're not seeing it. And in that vacuum, paramilitaries and those promoting political violence are stepping in. And the victims are Latinos and immigrants and Muslims and Jews and everyday Americans who have to go to work, who have to go to school, and are being subjected to this violence.
I think it's really important and interesting as well that while their actions are manifesting as this anti-democratic sentiment, really it's about white Christian nationalism and wanting their idea of what a way of life should be, right? Imposed upon other people. So it's not so much, they believe in monarchy or some other careful analysis of political science. They believe in another form of government. It's more so coming from a place of hatred and racism and believing in these conspiracy theories. So how do we combat that specifically, more so than just having a bipartisan announcement, we condemn these acts of violence? What other steps can we take?
We have to take some specific steps. So the first step is we have to speak up, right, verbally, and defend American democracy. Right? We cannot defend democracy unless we name that it is a priority for the American public. Poll after poll consistently shows that the majority of Americans, including a significantly growing a percentage of white Americans, believe in the idea of an inclusive democracy, one that moves all of us, regardless of race, religion, gender, sexual orientation, national identity, forward together to a society where we can all live, love, worship, and work free from fear and bigotry. The white nationalist movement understands that the majority of America opposes its idea of exclusion and political violence. It understands that history and the arc of time is on the side of those of us who believe, right, that we can manage a democracy as a diverse society. So here's what we have to do. We have to continue to prepare to deal with the violence. Will be with us for some time, and we have to beware of attempts to drive us inside, right, and internally based off of that fear. So we have to come together. The second is we have to demand that the American government stands up and defends democracy. Where is the American government? Where are our federal agencies? And we have to talk to our elected officials and make sure that they are doing their job. The third is this. We have to get to know our neighbors. If there are folks who are seeking to rip us apart, right, and they're going to use the idea that we don't know one another, demographic anxiety, to fuel that division, the way we protect ourselves is to strengthen our relationships with our neighbors. We do that not by focusing on our politics, but the values that align us together, the idea of opportunity, the ideal of community, the ideal of safety. Let's start and remember that our values bind us together much more strongly than our politics, and that's where we need to start.
Thank you so much for joining us, Eric. And your work has proven that this is indeed possible. You've worked towards this end successfully on multiple occasions. Can you tell our viewers where to find more of your work?
Absolutely. People can find the work of those of us committed to democracy at raceforward.org and westernstatecenter.org. I look forward to seeing everyone there.
Thank you so much.